The first time Lieutenant Nora James set foot on the dusty tarmac of the forward operating base, she felt the weight of 100 stairs. It wasn't just because she was a woman, though that was part of it. It was the uniform she wore. Beneath the standard desert camouflage, the insignia on her collar told a story that didn't seem to fit the landscape of sharp, jagged mountains and the ever-present thrum of helicopters. She was a nurse. A critical care nurse, to be precise, one of the best at the military hospital in Landstuhl, Germany. But here, at FOB Chapman in the remote coast province of Afghanistan, she was an anomaly. Her orders were clear, if unusual. She was part of a pilot program to embed specialized medical personnel with frontline reconnaissance units. The logic was sound. In the mountains, where the golden hour for trauma care stretched into a perilous 5 or 6, having a high-level provider on site could mean the difference between life and death. But logic and the ingrained culture of a special operations unit often clashed. The team she was assigned to, a mixed unit of Navy SEALs and Army engineers, had been tasked with a critical mission: secure and hold an old strategic bridge that spanned a deep ravine on the main supply route to a nearby village. The bridge was a choke point. If the Taliban took it, they could cut off the village, and more importantly, isolate a key valley where intelligence suggested a major insurgent leader was hiding. The mission was dangerous, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse in enemy territory. From the moment she was introduced to the team in the stifling heat of the planning tent, the atmosphere was icy. The team leader, a grizzled senior chief named Marcus Bull Radcliffe, looked at her as if she were a piece of malfunctioning gear. His eyes, the color of slate, swept over her with a dismissiveness that was palpable. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice a low growl that silenced the tent. "They're sending us a medic, a nurse, for a direct action mission to secure a bridge." He leaned back in his chair, the canvas groaning under his weight. "Ma'am, with all due respect, medics don't belong in combat. They're liabilities. When the shooting starts, you're another person we have to keep alive. You'll be in the way." A few of the other operators, hard-faced men with calloused hands, nodded in agreement. One of them, a young, wiry sniper with the unlikely name of Preacher, because he was so quiet, just stared at her from the corner, his eyes unreadable. He was the one they called the Ghost, their most effective shooter, a man who could seemingly melt into the rocks themselves. Nora felt a hot flush of anger, but she had spent years in the chaos of an emergency room, dealing with arrogant surgeons and panicked families. She had learned to control her reactions. She met Bull's gaze steadily. "Senior Chief, I'm not here to be a burden. I'm here to make sure that if any of you get hit, you don't bleed out waiting for a helicopter that might not make it through the flak. My job is to keep you in the fight, or at least keep you alive until you can get back to it." Bull just grunted, turning back to the map on the table, effectively dismissing her. "Just stay with the command element. Keep your head down. Let the professionals work." The insertion was under the cover of a moonless night. The Black Hawk helicopter thundered low over the mountains, the wind whipping through the open door. Nora was wedged between two massive SEALs, her medical pack clutched to her chest. It was heavier than a standard combat load, filled with advanced airway equipment, blood products, and surgical tools. The other men carried their own weight in ammunition and water. She felt a surge of determination. She would prove them wrong. She had to. The helicopter flared and touched down in a cloud of dust, a click from the bridge. The team spilled out, a dark tide of controlled violence. Nora followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence of the mountains was absolute, broken only by the fading sound of the rotors. They moved as a single organism, navigating by the dim green glow of night vision. Nora struggled to keep up, her pack feeling heavier with every step, the loose rocks threatening to turn her ankle. She was a ghost in her own right, but a clumsy one, an unwelcome spirit in their world of perfect, lethal silence. They reached their overwatch position, a rocky outcrop overlooking the bridge, just as the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky. The bridge was a stark, ugly thing of rusted steel and concrete, spanning a terrifying drop. Preacher, the quiet sniper, immediately began setting up his position, his movements fluid and economical. He chose a spot slightly apart from the main group, nestled between two boulders, his long-barreled rifle a dark extension of his body. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. As the sun rose, painting the valley in hues of gold and amber, the tension was a physical presence. They could see the village in the distance, and on the far side of the bridge, movement. Insurgents. They were setting up their own positions, dragging heavy weapons into place. They were going to contest the bridge. The first hour was a tense standoff. Then, a crack. A single shot from the village. A puff of dust erupted a few feet from one of the engineers who was scouting the near end of the bridge. The firefight erupted in an instant. The air filled with the deafening roar of machine guns and the sharper, more personal crack of AK-47s. The SEALs returned fire, their movements precise and practiced. Bull was shouting orders, his voice a calm island in a sea of chaos. Nora was flat on her stomach behind a rock, her face in the dirt. This was it. This was the moment they all expected her to freeze. The bullets whined overhead, a sound she had only ever heard in movies. It was terrifying. Her entire body was screaming at her to curl into a ball. But then, her training, a different kind of training, kicked in. It wasn't about tactics or shooting, it was about assessing. She lifted her head, forcing herself to look. She wasn't a shooter, she was a watcher, a healer. And in that moment, she saw something they didn't. One of the engineers, a young kid named Sanchez, was trying to get a better angle to fire his grenade launcher. He exposed himself for just a second too long. A burst of machine gun fire from the far side of the bridge stitched across his position. He went down with a scream, tumbling backwards into a shallow depression, clutching his leg. The scream cut through the noise of battle, a sound of pure, primal agony. For a second, everything froze for Nora. The medics, the professionals, they were all pinned down by heavy, accurate fire. Bull was yelling for a corpsman, but the team's medic was on the other side of the position, also suppressed. Sanchez was lying in a shallow, exposed dip. The bullets were kicking up dirt all around him. This was her moment. The moment they said she wasn't built for. The moment they said she would fail. Without a conscious thought, Nora moved. She didn't think about the bullets. She didn't think about proving a point. She only thought about Sanchez, bleeding in the dirt. She scrambled on her hands and knees, her heavy pack bouncing on her back, and slid into the depression next to him. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with shock and pain. His lower leg was a mess of blood and torn fabric, a femoral artery. The thought slammed into her brain with clinical clarity. He was bleeding out, fast. She ripped open her pack, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. She pulled out a tourniquet, her movements a blur of practiced efficiency. "You're okay, Sanchez," she said, her voice firm and calm, a stark contrast to the storm around them. "You're going to be just fine. Look at me. Look at me, soldier." As she tightened the tourniquet, the blood flow slowing to a trickle, a new sound joined the symphony of violence. It was a different kind of crack, sharper, more precise. The incoming fire from the far side of the bridge seemed to falter, then become erratic. One by one, the insurgents manning the heavy machine gun were slumping over their weapon. From their position on the ridge, Preacher was methodically working. He wasn't just firing, he was surgically removing the biggest threats, one bullet at a time. Each time his rifle spoke, another enemy gun fell silent. But the firefight was far from over. The insurgents were numerous and well dug in. While Preacher was silencing the heavy weapons, others were still firing. A bullet ricocheted off the rock inches from Nora's head, spraying her with stone chips. She didn't flinch. She was already pulling out a combat bandage, checking the tourniquet, stabilizing the wound. Her world had shrunk to the size of the man in front of her. She was completely, utterly focused. Minutes later, which felt like hours, a pause in the firing allowed two SEALs to rush over. They grabbed Sanchez, dragging him back to a more protected position behind the main rocks. Nora went with them, her hands still pressed to the wound, her own body a shield. She worked on him for another 20 minutes, starting an IV, administering pain medication, monitoring his vitals. She had done it. She had stopped him from bleeding out on that godforsaken slope. When it was over and the immediate threat had subsided, Bull looked over at her. He was covered in sweat and grime, his face smeared with camouflage paint. He didn't say a word. He just gave her a single sharp nod. It was the highest form of praise he could offer. In that moment, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She wasn't just the nurse anymore, she was part of the team. The success of the initial skirmish was a small victory, but the mission was far from over. They had held the near end of the bridge, but the enemy still controlled the far side and the approaches to the village. The team's orders were to secure the entire bridge, to make it passable for their own forces. The next phase would be even more dangerous, a direct assault across the open span. Bull gathered the team in the shallow wadi behind their defensive line. The sun was high now, baking the rocks. The body of one enemy fighter lay sprawled on the bridge, a grim reminder of the stakes. "They've got at least 2 PKM machine guns in those buildings on the far side," Bull said, pointing to a cluster of mud brick structures. "And we've seen at least a dozen fighters. If we try to cross in daylight, they'll cut us to pieces. We wait for nightfall. We use the darkness." He looked at Preacher. "Ghost, I need you to find a position. A better one. Somewhere you can see the whole far side. When we move, you're our guardian angel. Any muzzle flash, any movement, you take it out." Preacher, who had been quietly cleaning his rifle, just nodded. His gaze shifted briefly to Nora. It wasn't the dismissive look from before, it was appraising, curious. He then looked back at the terrain, his mind already working, calculating angles and distances. "There," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He pointed to a spire of rock, a lone sentinel about 400 meters to their left and 100 feet higher than their current position. "That's the only spot with a clear line of sight to both the bridge and the buildings. But it's a bare-ass rock, no cover. If they see me, I'm dead." Bull studied the spire. It was a death trap, exposed on 3 sides. "Can you do it?" Preacher didn't answer with words. He just picked up his rifle and began to move, a shadow detaching itself from the group. He moved with a patience that was almost inhuman, using every tiny fold in the ground for cover, freezing for minutes at a time when he sensed any movement from the enemy lines. It took him over 2 hours to cover the 400 meters, a journey that looked impossible to Nora's untrained eye. He finally reached the base of the spire and began a slow, painstaking climb, his body pressed flat against the rock. As dusk began to settle, casting long, purple shadows across the valley, the team prepared to move. Bull came over to Nora. "When we go, you're with me," he said. "Right on my 6. We get across, we find cover, and we set up a casualty collection point. If someone goes down on the bridge, you don't go to them. Not until we have suppressed the enemy fire enough to cover you. Understood? We can't have you running into the open." Nora nodded, her mouth dry. The plan was simple and terrifying. They would move in 2 fire teams, using the darkness and a continuous barrage of suppressing fire from their own machine guns and Preacher's sniper rifle to get across the 200-meter span. It was a gamble, a leap of faith. The signal came, a series of 3 quick flashes from Preacher's position. He was in place. Bull gave the hand signal, and the first team rose as one and moved onto the bridge. They were silent, their footsteps barely a whisper on the old concrete. Nora followed Bull, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the enemy could hear it. The chasm below yawned, a dark abyss. They were halfway across when it happened. A flare ignited in the sky above the village, a brilliant white star that descended slowly on a small parachute, bathing the entire bridge in harsh, unforgiving light. They were silhouettes, completely exposed. For a single heart-stopping second, there was silence. Then, all hell broke loose. The 2 PKM machine guns opened up from the buildings, their tracer rounds creating a deadly red river across the bridge. The sound was deafening, a continuous tearing roar. The team hit the deck, pressing themselves against the low side rail of the bridge, the only meager cover available. "Go, go, go!" Bull roared. But going was impossible. The fire was too intense, too accurate. The concrete around them exploded in puffs of dust and deadly fragments. And then, from the spire, Preacher's rifle began to speak. It was a different sound from the chattering machine guns, a single sharp crack that cut through the mayhem. One of the PKMs fell silent. Then a few seconds later, the second one stopped. But the enemy was adaptable. Muzzle flashes erupted from windows, from behind rocks, from every shadow on the far bank. The team was pinned down by a dozen different shooters. Nora was lying flat, the concrete cold against her cheek. She could see one of the SEALs from the first team, a big man named Kowalski, writhing in pain a few meters ahead. He'd been hit in the shoulder. He was trying to crawl, but he was losing strength. He was a sitting duck. Bull was shouting into his radio, trying to coordinate return fire, but the enemy was too spread out. This was a massacre in the making. Then Preacher did something unexpected. His rifle fell silent. The team was now taking fire with no counter-sniper cover. For a terrifying minute, they were completely vulnerable. But Preacher hadn't stopped fighting. He had realized that from his current position, he couldn't engage all the shooters simultaneously. He needed a different perspective, a more mobile one. In a move that defied all logic and self-preservation, he slung his rifle, stood up on his exposed spire, and began to move. He didn't retreat. He climbed higher. He reached the very tip of the rock, a point no larger than a dinner table with zero cover. From this new, dizzying height, he had a 360-degree view of the battlefield. He could see the enemy positions that were hidden from everyone else. He dropped to one knee, utterly exposed against the skyline, a perfect target, and began to fire. He fired with a speed and precision that was almost supernatural. He wasn't just shooting, he was painting a masterpiece of destruction. Every shot found its mark. A muzzle flash here, a shooter there. He was a one-man army, drawing the enemy's fire onto himself to give his teammates a chance. The enemy saw him. Bullets began to chip away at the rock around him, whining past his head. He didn't flinch. He just kept shooting, his face a mask of absolute concentration. Seeing their guardian angel in mortal danger ignited something in the team on the bridge. "Now! While he's got their attention!" Bull yelled. The SEALs rose, firing from the hip as they sprinted forward. They had to reach the far side. They had to take the pressure off Preacher. But Kowalski was still down, bleeding and unable to move. The team was passing him by, their focus on the immediate threat. Nora looked at Bull, then at the wounded man. Bull saw the look in her eyes. "No!" he shouted. "Stay down!" It was the same command from before. Stay with the command element. Let the professionals work. But Nora wasn't just a medic anymore. She was a professional too. Her profession was saving lives, and a life was slipping away 20 meters in front of her. She didn't see a battle. She saw a patient. Ignoring Bull's command, she got to her feet. The world seemed to slow down. She saw the tracer rounds floating through the air. She saw Preacher on his pinnacle of rock, a dark statue against the flare-lit sky, firing relentlessly. She saw the enemy shooters, their faces just dark shapes in the windows. And she saw Kowalski. She ran, not with the tactical crouch of a soldier, but with the desperate, flat-out sprint of a mother running to a fallen child. She heard Bull scream her name, a sound of pure fury. She heard the crack of bullets passing so close they made her ears ring. She ran 20 meters that felt like a mile. She slid to her knees next to Kowalski, her medical pack already open. The wound in his shoulder was bad, but not immediately life-threatening. What was life-threatening was the fact that they were lying in the middle of a fire-lit bridge. She had to move him. Now. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she grabbed him by his body armor and dragged him. She pulled him towards the far end of the bridge, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning. She was a slow, clumsy target, but she kept moving. Bullets sparked off the concrete inches from her. And all the while, Preacher watched her. From his godlike perch, he saw her courage, her pure, unadulterated determination. It wasn't tactical. It wasn't smart. It was something else entirely. It was the essence of why he fought, of what he was trying to protect. It was humanity. He shifted his focus. He stopped engaging the distant machine gunners and focused entirely on the shooters who were aiming at the slow-moving target on the bridge. He became her personal protector. An enemy fighter would pop up to take a shot at her, and Preacher's bullet would find him before his finger could squeeze the trigger. He was a shield of lead, an angel of death clearing a path for an angel of mercy. Finally, with a last, heaving effort, Nora dragged Kowalski off the bridge and into the cover of a low stone wall on the far bank. She was gasping, covered in sweat and concrete dust. She immediately went to work on his wound, her hands trembling but her mind clear. She had done it. The SEALs, seeing her success and inspired by her insane bravery, redoubled their efforts. They stormed the first building, clearing it with methodical violence. The enemy's fire began to falter, then break. They were no longer fighting a military unit, they were fighting an idea, a force that combined lethal precision with a seemingly reckless will to preserve life. It was a combination they couldn't counter. As the last shots echoed and died away in the valley, a profound silence descended. The bridge was theirs. The mission was a success. Bull walked over to where Nora was kneeling next to Kowalski, who was now stable and conscious, thanks to her quick work. Bull looked down at her. His face was a mess of emotions, fury, admiration, and a deep, profound respect. "I told you to stay," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know," Nora replied, not looking up from her patient. "But he would have died." Bull opened his mouth to say something else, but no words came. He just shook his head, a faint, disbelieving smile touching the corner of his mouth. He turned and walked away. Later, as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, Preacher made his way down from his spire and across the now quiet bridge. He walked up to Nora, who was sitting against the wall, exhausted, drinking from a canteen. He stood over her for a moment, his angular face still smudged with camouflage. He was a man of very few words, but his eyes, which had been so cold and distant, now held a glimmer of warmth. He didn't say, "Good job." He didn't say, "You were brave." He reached into a small pouch on his vest and pulled out a patch. It was a small, subdued SEAL trident, the emblem of the teams. He held it out to her. Nora looked at the patch, then up at him. She didn't understand. "For your pack," he said, his voice a low murmur. "So they know. You belong." He turned and walked away, melting back into the team, the ghost once more. Nora looked down at the small patch in her palm. It was heavier than it looked. It was an acceptance, hard-won and deeply meaningful, from the quietest, most lethal man on the team. She had faced their ridicule, their doubt, and a hail of enemy fire. She had run into the kill zone when every instinct told her to hide. She had dragged a man to safety while a sniper cleared her path. She had proven that a medic, a healer, didn't just belong in combat. In the right hands, a healer could be the most powerful weapon of all. She carefully pinned the patch to the inside of her medical pack, a secret badge of honor, a reminder of the night she became one of them.